Welcome back, my friends, my fellow wanderers of literature and film, my companions in thought. Tonight, as I sit with you once more in this little corner we've carved out for deep explorations, I find myself drawn toward the strange, the eerie, and the inevitable. There's a film that's found its way into my mind, one that does not just present itself as a piece of entertainment, but as a provocation, an invitation to reflect on the fragile line between destiny and coincidence, between fear and inevitability. That film is Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025. And before we journey forward, let me ask you with genuine warmth. If you find yourself drawn to these kind of conversations, where films are more than just stories but reflections of our shared humanity, do take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and perhaps even ring the bell, so you remain part of this ongoing exchange. This is not a conventional review, my friends. It is not a verdict on whether the film deserves 3 stars or 4, nor a comparison to weekend blockbusters. No, what I am offering here is something far more personal, far more critical, and, dare I say, far more literary. This is a meditation disguised as a review, an essay woven into narrative form, where the texture of the film meets the fabric of our human experience. What always fascinates me about horror, and perhaps what has always pulled me in closer than I expect, is not simply its shocks or the flickers of violence on screen, but its underlying philosophy. Horror, when done thoughtfully, is among the most honest genres. It strips away pretense and forces us to confront questions we'd rather leave undisturbed. Why do we live the way we do, knowing death is inevitable? How much of our existence is governed by chance, and how much by some great unseen order? Sitting with this movie, I couldn't help but recall certain moments from my own life where an accident nearly happened, where fate seemed to reach out a hand. Moments on a road, moments in flight, even something as mundane as missing a bus or taking a different turn. And I think you, too, may know that strange chill when you realize how easily everything could have been different. The premise of this film, as with its predecessors, works like a mirror reflecting that unease. It begins innocently enough, as they all do, with a group of seemingly ordinary characters, lives woven with trivialities and desires that feel almost universal. They could be us, really, caught between planned distractions, laughter, and silence. But soon, very soon, the threads of their existence unravel in ways both spectacular and terrifying. This has always been the genius of this particular series. It doesn't so much create monsters as it personifies inevitability itself. Death is not a cloaked figure nor a beast in the shadows. It is the silent mathematics of reality, the certainty that what begins must end, and that the universe sometimes chooses strange, cruelly ironic timings. As I watched, I felt the film's atmosphere bleed into me like a half-remembered dream. Its opening sequence is crafted with such intensity that I found myself leaning forward instinctively, unable to resist the pull of inevitability it creates. I thought the first time I experienced the original entry in this series, long ago, as a teenager still trying to reconcile my fascination with the macabre with my love for literature. There was something poetic about it even then, its fixation on the fragile scaffolding of chance. This new installment resurrects that same haunting rhythm, but with a modern sharpness that feels both unsettling and strangely beautiful. The overview of the film reveals a careful balance between honoring the legacy of what came before and carving out something distinct. The characters feel less like archetypes this time, less like disposable placeholders, and more like individuals carrying a weight of backstories, burdens, and fears that resonate with us. The film understands that the terror of inevitability grows sharper when you care, even briefly, about those caught in its snare. There is one character in particular, without spoiling details, that reminded me of someone I once knew, someone whose constant worry about the fragility of life became almost unbearable to watch, and yet strangely admirable. Watching this portrayal stirred up a cascade of personal recollections, moments where conversations about fate and fear turned into late-night debates about whether the universe truly has an order, or whether we cling to patterns only because we fear chaos. When I consider the way the story is constructed, I find myself in awe of its deliberate pacing. The narrative teases us, toys with us, presenting ordinary situations, a highway, a gathering, a household object, and then twisting them with such ferocity that you begin to see danger everywhere. And isn't that, in its own way, the hallmark of effective horror? It lingers, reshaping your gaze long after credits roll. It's not the jump scares that stay with you. It's the shift in perception. You walk down the street and suddenly wonder what would happen if the wind carried that signpost differently, or if the car ahead of you swerved in the wrong moment. The film taps into that primal fear, that we are never entirely in control. The plot summary, though I must keep it brief and only brush its surface, unfolds like a taut thread pulling tighter and tighter. It begins with an ensemble of characters bound not by choice but by circumstance, and soon one of them glimpses what should not be glimpsed, an accident yet to unfold, a disaster of almost mythic cruelty. That vision, that shiver of foresight, becomes a catalyst. The group escapes, or so it seems. But as those familiar with the story world know, escape is an illusion. What follows is the unraveling of their lives, one by one, in sequences that feel as much like grim poetry as cinematic spectacle. Each demise is staged not merely as shock but as revelation, as though the universe itself is writing in verse, reminding us of its power. There are, of course, key elements and major twists that shift the direction of the story in unexpected ways. Without laying them bare just yet, I can say that this film has found a way to reimagine inevitability itself, giving it new contours, new philosophical dimensions. At certain moments, I found myself not recoiling in fear, but almost in admiration for the cleverness with which fate had been woven into the mechanics of storytelling. There's a scene, brief but unforgettable, where you realize that survival is never just survival, that every narrow escape carries within it the seed of a new doom. That paradox lies at the heart of the experience, and it left me shaken, sitting here now, reflecting with you as though we were sharing coffee after a long, haunting night. I find myself marveling at how a story like this continues to evolve. It is not simply about who dies or how, though those are certainly the most visible parts. It is about the deeper unease that all of us feel when we admit we are not the authors of our own fates. The film stages that unease theatrically, but its true power lies in how it resonates within us long afterward. And so, as we prepare to move forward in our exploration, into the plot's unfolding, into the labyrinth of character and theme, into strained production secrets that make stories like this possible, I invite you to hold on to that feeling, the sensation of inevitability pressing close, the recognition that even the most ordinary moment can bend into catastrophe. Because it is in that recognition, my friends, that we discover not just what frightens us, but what makes us human. The story begins quietly, almost deceptively, with an ordinary setting that seems unthreatening at first glance. I've always found this contrast fascinating, how horror films, especially those steeped in inevitability, love to begin with the mundane. It is as though the film itself whispers to us, "Look at how safe you feel right now, just wait." That whisper hovers here too. The opening moments introduce us to a small group of people whose lives are about to converge in the strangest and most tragic ways. The film doesn't shout this truth, but it allows it to simmer beneath the surface. And as I watched, I could not help but think of all the times in my own life when ordinary days, bus rides, family dinners, laughter with friends, later took on unexpected significance, as though destiny had been quietly arranging pieces without my knowledge. The first set of characters are young but not naive, weary but not broken. Each carries a shadow, a fragment of backstory that marks them as more than mere placeholders for the audience's fear. There's an immediate sense of recognition. The overachiever who carries too much weight on their shoulders, the friend who masks anxiety with humor, the quiet one who feels almost invisible. Their interactions are simple but layered with small hints that these are real people, not cardboard cutouts. And as I watched them move through their daily routines, I found myself reflecting on how often we overlook the fullness of the people around us. That stranger at the bus stop, that coworker we pass in the hallway, they all carry narratives as complex as our own. This film reminds us of that, even as it readies them for the cruel grip of inevitability. Then comes the event, the accident that isn't, at least not yet, the premonition. That signature element of this franchise unfurls in a way that feels both familiar and freshly terrifying. I have always been struck by how these visions are staged, not simply as images, but as experiences, immersive and suffocating. The character who receives a vision, our unwilling seer, is caught in it fully, as though their senses are hijacked by inevitability itself. And as I followed its unraveling, I thought of times when I too have felt jolts of inexplicable foreboding, the sense that something was wrong, even when everything seemed fine. Perhaps you know this feeling. The sudden tightening in the chest before boarding a plane, the irrational suspicion before stepping into a car. Most of the time, these feelings fade, dismissed as paranoia. But here, in this story, they bloom into terrifying truth. The disaster envisioned is staged with brutal precision. It unfolds slowly at first, letting us savor every anxious detail. The hum of machinery, the flicker of a distracted driver, the trembling of something unstable. Then it builds piece by horrifying piece, until chaos erupts in a crescendo of violence. The deaths are grotesque but almost poetic in their inevitability, an intricate chain reaction where every small error leads to catastrophe. Watching it, I was reminded of dominoes tumbling, each fall setting the next into motion. And in that cascade, I saw the reflection of life itself. How a single misstep, a single overlooked detail, can sometimes redirect the entire course of existence. But then, the breath is pulled back. The vision ends. The character jolts awake, drenched in panic, and the world is still intact. I always find this moment the most haunting. The realization that knowledge of death does not liberate but burdens. Because what do you do when you've seen the future? How do you convince others to believe you when even you can't fully believe yourself? Here, the film captures the raw urgency of that question. The character tries, desperately, to warn the others, to gather them and force them away from what they do not yet know. There is chaos in their urgency, disbelief in the faces around them, and then the inevitable proof. The disaster begins exactly as foretold. And yet, through their intervention, a handful survive. This first escape always feels like a victory laced with poison. As I watch the survivors stumble away from the carnage, their faces pale and their breaths ragged, I felt that strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief because they lived when others didn't. Dread because I knew, as they too would soon know, that life had only been loaned to them, not gifted. And that tension is what drives the rest of the story. It reminded me of moments in my own life when I narrowly avoided accidents. Close calls on the road, a moment of hesitation that spared me from danger. At first, there is gratitude, but later comes unease. Why did I survive when others didn't? What does it mean to walk away when fate seemed to call your name? This film captures that haunting unease perfectly. The survivors form a fragile circle, their connection forged in terror rather than friendship. And here, the narrative slows just enough to let us see how they struggle with the aftermath. Some cling to denial, pretending the vision was mere coincidence. Others spiral into paranoia, convinced that death is stalking them. Their conversations crackle with tension. One scoffs at superstition. Another insists there's a pattern, a design. Watching these exchanges, I thought of how we humans wrestle with tragedy in real life, how we invent stories, assign blame, cling to logic, or turn to faith. In the face of randomness, we demand order. In the face of inevitability, we construct meaning. This film mirrors a human struggle beautifully. As the days pass, the pattern emerges. One by one, the survivors meet their end, each death staged with an almost artistic irony. What unsettled me most was not the gore, but the creativity of inevitability itself. Death here is not mindless. It is deliberate, almost mocking. A loose wire, a slipping object, a sudden gust of wind. Each ordinary detail conspires to become lethal. I found myself glancing around my own space after watching, noticing precarious placement of objects, the fragility of routines. It's a chilling reminder that our environments, so familiar and safe, can become the stage for our undoing at any moment. One sequence in particular remains lodged in my mind, a character whose death is hinted at long before it arrives. The film teases us with near misses, with small accidents that don't quite happen. A glass nearly falls but doesn't shatter. A car nearly swerves but steadies. These moments stretch the tension unbearably until the actual demise occurs in a swift, merciless burst. That toying with inevitability feels almost cruel, and yet it mirrors life so well. How often do we walk close to disaster without realizing it? How many times have we brushed past tragedy without ever knowing? The film turns that invisible truth into spectacle. The survivors, desperate, begin to piece together the rules. They whisper about order, about patterns, about ways to cheat inevitability. And as I watch their frantic reasoning, I recognize something deeply human in it. We all do this. We invent rituals, seek omens, create systems that give us a sense of control over what cannot be controlled. It reminded me of superstitions passed down in families. The idea that avoiding a certain number or carrying a small token might stave off disaster. Rationally, we know these things hold no power, but emotionally, they give us something to cling to. In the film, the survivors cling to such reasoning, desperate to find a loophole in death's design. The first half of the story is marked not only by escalating deaths, but by deepening fractures within the group. Trust erodes quickly. Accusations fly. Why did you warn us? Why only us? Why not others? Resentment builds. Some blame the one who had the vision. Others blame fate itself. The group becomes less a circle of allies and more a collection of individuals united only by fear. And I thought then of how tragedy tests bonds in real life. Families fracture under grief. Friends drift apart under the weight of trauma. Crisis reveals not only our strength, but also our breaking points. This story holds up that uncomfortable mirror. Midway through, the film plants a seed of something new, a hint that there may be an even deeper connection among the survivors, something stretching beyond coincidence. Bloodlines, the title suggests, and the narrative begins to gesture toward ancestry, toward inherited fate. Though the details remain hazy at this stage, the suggestion is enough to thicken the atmosphere. I found this addition fascinating because it transforms inevitability from a universal force into something almost personal, intimate. If fate runs in blood, then perhaps we are not merely unlucky victims, but heirs to patterns we cannot escape. This idea lingered in my mind, making me think of family histories, of generational echoes, of the strange ways in which tragedy sometimes seems to repeat itself across time. As the first half draws toward its midpoint climax, the tension reaches a fever pitch. The survivors are no longer merely reacting. They are hunting for answers, desperate to break the cycle. They consult records, seek out others who might understand, attempt to decipher the cruel arithmetic of death's design. Their search leads them into darker spaces, both literal and psychological. And as I watched them descend deeper into obsession, I felt that uneasy recognition again. Isn't this what we all do when we brush too closely against mortality? We seek explanations. We read philosophies, explore sciences, whisper prayers, invent stories, all in the hope of taming that which cannot be tamed. By this point, the story has shifted from mere spectacle to something heavier, more suffocating. The characters are worn thin, their fear palpable, their hope fragile. The deaths continue to mount, each more elaborate, each more inevitable. And yet, beneath the horror, there's a strange beauty. The film manages to turn inevitability into a kind of poetry, each demise a stanza in a grim narrative that insists on being told. I sat watching, torn between dread and fascination, between recoiling from brutality and leaning in to savor its haunting artistry. As the screen darkened to signal the turning point, I found myself unsettled not only by what I had witnessed, but by what it stirred within me. The first half of this story doesn't simply frighten. It unsettles, it provokes. It forces us to question the invisible threads that weave our lives together. And as the survivors stumbled toward the unknown, battered by loss and gnawed by fear, I too felt drawn forward, compelled to see how inevitability would unfold in its cruel, relentless dance. The second stretch of the tale emerges not with a moment of relief, but with an intensification of dread. The survivors who remain are visibly marked, as if they've aged years in only days. Their faces carry the imprint of sleepless nights. Their voices grow quieter, more fractured, their movements jittery with paranoia. Watching them, I was struck by how fear shapes the body. You can see it in the eyes, the posture, even in the way someone breathes. I thought of a time in my own life when fear lingered too long, when it hollowed out the hours and left me pacing in silence, and how much it resembled the haunted fragility of these characters. The film captures that erosion perfectly, the way dread seeps in slowly, then takes over entirely. One of the things that haunts me about this series and about this installment in particular, is how the deaths themselves seem less about spectacle in the second half and more about inevitability closing its grip. Early on, the film plays with near misses, teasing both characters and audience with small mercies before unleashing terror. But now, as the second half begins, mercy feels absent. The deaths arrive more suddenly, more cruelly, as if inevitability has grown tired of toying with its prey. This shift unsettled me deeply because it reminded me of how real life often works. At first, danger seems avoidable. You swerve, you survive. But eventually, something comes along too swift, too decisive to escape. The story mimics that brutal acceleration. The group, desperate, begins to splinter further. Each survivor copes differently. One grows obsessive, scribbling diagrams and tracing patterns as if sheer logic can outwit destiny. Another clings to denial, insisting they've escaped for good, that the deaths are over. Another becomes reckless, daring fate to strike, as if embracing danger could somehow neutralize it. These different responses echo human behavior in crisis. I've seen it in families enduring illness, in friends enduring grief. Some fight, some flee, some surrender. The film magnifies these responses, letting them clash violently until trust becomes impossible. What makes this portion of the story even heavier is the deepening suggestion that bloodlines matter, that the chain of survival and death is not random but woven into heritage itself. The characters begin uncovering histories, family ties that stretch backward into past tragedies, events that echo eerily across generations. I found myself shivering at this idea. In literature, we often speak of inherited guilt, inherited trauma, the sins of the fathers passed down. Here, inevitability becomes another inheritance, passed like a curse. Watching it, I couldn't help but think of my own family, of stories whispered about distant ancestors, and the strange repetitions that seem to occur across time. Have you ever noticed how some misfortunes, some patterns, seem to repeat in families as if scripted? This film seizes on that unease and makes it a central thread. The deaths themselves become more elaborate in this half, not in the sense of gore, but in the sense of psychological torment. One sequence involves a character who believes they've discovered a loophole, a way to cheat inevitability. They cling to it with desperate hope, only to discover in the most crushing way that the loophole was an illusion. The moment it happens, I felt my chest tighten. Because isn't that what we all do in life? We believe in loopholes, in good luck charms, in rituals, in bargains with the universe. We think, if I do this, if I avoid that, I'll be safe. And yet, deep down, we know no bargain can hold forever. The story tears this illusion apart mercilessly, leaving us in the character with nothing but silence. By now, the group is nearly halved again, each death carving not only bodies but bonds. And with each loss, the survivors grow more erratic, their decisions more desperate. There's a sense of claustrophobia, as if inevitability is not only following them but surrounding them, seeping into every space. I remember watching one scene where a character sits in a seemingly safe room, eyes darting at every detail. The ceiling fan, the loose cord, the glass on the counter. The tension is unbearable because everything, absolutely everything, is a potential weapon of fate. That scene stayed with me afterward. I caught myself scanning my own room in the same way, wondering what objects could betray me if inevitability chose this moment. That's the peculiar genius of this story. It makes ordinary life sinister. As the second half progresses, the survivors' search for answers intensifies. They seek out records of past accidents. They track down others who once escaped fate. They pore over dusty archives in an attempt to decipher the logic of death's design. These investigative sequences remind me of Gothic literature, the desperate search for forbidden knowledge, the slow uncovering of truths too heavy to bear. The irony, of course, is that knowledge does not save them. In fact, knowledge only deepens their despair. The more they learn, the clearer it becomes. There is no escape, only delay. This theme resonates painfully with real life, where we often pursue knowledge hoping for salvation, only to discover truths that wound more deeply. One of the film's most powerful twists emerges here. The realization that fate's design is not linear but cyclical, that their survival may have consequences for others outside their circle. This revelation redefines everything. Survival is no longer personal. It carries ripples that spread outward. One survivor even suggests that perhaps the only way to break the cycle is through sacrifice, through willingly offering themselves to inevitability. This idea struck me with brutal force because it reflects an ancient truth found in myths and rituals across cultures, that survival sometimes requires sacrifice, that life is sustained through loss. The film modernizes this archetype, embedding it in a story about chance and death, and it hits with startling weight. The tension mounts toward the climax in a crescendo of paranoia and violence. The remaining survivors are frayed beyond repair, their relationships shattered, their minds exhausted. In one unforgettable sequence, they argue violently, each insisting their way is the only way, until fate intervenes with merciless swiftness, silencing one of them in a death so abrupt that it leaves both characters and audience stunned. It is in these moments that the film transcends simple horror. It becomes tragedy. You do not watch a monster devour its prey. You watch inevitability erase someone mid-sentence. That suddenness is perhaps the cruelest cut of all. The climax arrives with the survivors making one last desperate attempt to cheat fate. They devise a plan risky and elaborate, based on their interpretations of the rules. Watching them, I found myself rooting for them despite knowing better. Hope is stubborn like that. It blooms even in poisoned soil. Their plan unfolds with nail-biting tension, every step feeling like a potential trigger for catastrophe. And for a brief moment, it seems to work. For a brief, fleeting heartbeat, it feels as if they've won. I could almost feel the air in my chest lighten, as though the film had granted mercy. But mercy is not part of this universe. The twist lands with devastating finality. Their plan does not free them. It only rearranges the order, reshaping inevitability into a crueler pattern. The deaths resume with renewed force, and the survivors realize too late that their resistance only tightened the snare. The cruel poetry of inevitability asserts itself fully, leaving them broken and stunned. Watching it, I felt the ache of inevitability not only as fear, but as recognition. How many times in life have we thought we outsmarted danger, only to discover that our victory was temporary, our reprieve borrowed? The final sequence is staged with haunting beauty. The last remaining characters stand together, bound by terror and resignation, their eyes hollow yet strangely calm. They have come to understand that survival is not guaranteed, that inevitability will find its way, that their only choice is how they face it. The ending does not shout but whispers, offering a quiet devastation that lingers long after credits roll. I sat in silence as it ended, not because I was shocked, but because I was heavy with recognition. The story had shown me, yet again, what I already knew but preferred to forget. That death is certain, that control is illusion, that life's fragility is both terrifying and strangely beautiful. As the screen faded, I thought of my own life, of the close calls and narrow escapes, of the days when death brushed past but didn't stop. And I thought of how this story magnifies that truth, dressing it in spectacle so we cannot look away. The second half is not merely horror. It is reflection. It is tragedy. It is philosophy. It does not terrify for the sake of terror, but unsettles to remind us of something profound. That life's beauty lies in its brevity, and that every breath is borrowed. What has always fascinated me about these stories is not merely the way fate asserts itself, but the way people respond when stripped of illusions. Characters are never just vessels for death. They are vessels for fear, for denial, for courage, for desperate hope. In Final Destination, Bloodlines, 2025, the ensemble cast is not presented as disposable figures to be chewed up by spectacle, but as real people, distinct and complex, who carry pieces of us within them. Their unraveling becomes as compelling as the deaths themselves. And so, as I sat with their faces and gestures, I found myself drawn into a deeper contemplation of who they are, what they reveal about humanity, and why they matter long after the screen fades to black. The central figure, the one burdened with a vision, occupies a place that is both tragic and strangely heroic. This character is not a chosen savior, but an unwilling seer, someone thrust into knowledge they never asked for. I watched their fear pulse through every line of dialogue, their body tense as though they carried a weight too heavy for their frame. What made them compelling to me was not just their foresight, but their fragility. They were not fearless, not invincible, but trembling and uncertain, and that made them real. I remembered a time when I knew something terrible was about to happen in my own life, not with supernatural clarity, but with the unmistakable feeling that events were about to collapse. The helplessness of knowing without being able to prevent it is unbearable. This character embodies a helplessness, and in doing so, they become more than protagonists. They become a mirror. Surrounding them is a circle of survivors who each embody a different aspect of humanity's response to fate. There is the skeptic, the one who scoffs at visions and insists everything is coincidence. Their denial is infuriating at times, but also deeply human. I've met people like this, people who refuse to admit the possibility of forces beyond reason, who cling to logic even when the evidence screams otherwise. Watching this character reminded me of arguments with friends who dismissed intuition or dismissed fear as irrational, even when their own lives were tangled in its grip. They are necessary, though, for they remind us of how fragile belief is, how fragile trust is, when the unexplainable intrudes. Another survivor responds not with denial but with obsession. They're the one who scribbles notes, traces patterns, and believes fervently that the design can be deciphered. Their eyes burn with the desperate glow of someone who refuses to accept helplessness. I found this character both admirable and heartbreaking, because their need for control is both relatable and doomed. How often do we, in our own lives, attempt to impose systems on chaos? How often do we convince ourselves that if we just think hard enough, analyze long enough, we can wrestle life into order? Watching them reminded me of my own journals, filled with charts and patterns from times when I tried to make sense of pain through logic. Their eventual downfall is not just tragic, it is inevitable, because the flaw lies not in their intelligence, but in their assumption that inevitability can be mapped. Then there's the reckless one, the character who embraces danger as if daring death to strike. Their bravado is a mask, and beneath it lies terror so great that it curdles into defiance. This figure fascinated me most because they reminded me of friends I've known who laughed too loudly at funerals, who drove too fast after heartbreak, who sought thrill not because they loved life, but because they could not face its fragility. Their every gesture seemed to scream, "If I can't escape fate, I will meet it on my terms." Watching them was both exhilarating and sad, because their rebellion was not freedom, but surrender in disguise. Among the survivors, there is also the quiet one, almost invisible, whose fear is internalized rather than externalized. They speak little, they flinch often, and their silence carries volumes. I found myself thinking of how many people in life endure terror in silence, without outward protest, absorbing dread into their very bones. Their presence in the group is subtle but crucial, because they remind us that not all responses to inevitability are loud. Some are quiet implosions, hidden from sight until it's too late. What deepens the characters in this story is the thread of bloodlines hinted at throughout. The survivors are not simply random individuals caught in a freak accident. They carry with them ancestral weight, histories that stretch backward into past tragedies. Each character's lineage becomes a shadow, and their deaths are not just personal but echoes of something older. This detail transforms them from strangers into inheritors of a curse, and it adds a chilling intimacy to their unraveling. Watching them, I thought of how families carry trauma across generations. Some inherit addiction. Some inherit silence. Some inherit the echoes of violence. Here, they inherit inevitability itself. The characters are haunted not only by what they see before them, but by what lingers behind them, unseen but felt. The interactions among the group reveal layers of humanity under pressure. In one moment, they cling to each other desperately, united by fear. In the next, they turn on each other, hurling accusations and resentment. I found these shifts painfully realistic. Tragedy binds, but it also fractures. I remembered nights with friends when we faced crisis together, at first holding each other tight, then snapping in anger when fear became too much. The film captures this fragility of human connection, showing how survival can either knit people together or tear them apart. Individually, the characters might seem archetypal, the skeptic, the believer, the rebel, the seer, but together they form a kaleidoscope of human response to death. None of them are perfect, none of them are saints, and that is why they feel so true. Each carries flaws that make them vulnerable, flaws that death exploits mercilessly. But each also carries small flashes of courage, of tenderness, of humanity that make their losses sting. When one character dies, it is not just spectacle. It is a silencing of a distinct human voice, and it hurts. One of the most striking character arcs belongs to the one who first denies everything but slowly, painfully, begins to believe. Watching their transformation was like watching a wall crumble. At first, their disbelief feels almost comforting. Someone grounded, someone rational, someone who refuses to give in to hysteria. But as deaths pile up, their walls crack, and when the belief finally seeps in, it is devastating. I thought of moments when I, too, could no longer deny what was right before me, moments when truth shattered the comfort of disbelief. This character embodies that painful journey, and their collapse is perhaps more haunting than their death. Another arc that lingers with me is that of the obsessive survivor. Their intensity grows with each passing moment until it consumes them entirely. They become almost priest-like, as though deciphering fate has become a form of worship. Watching their eyes, I could almost feel the heat of their desperation, their need to be right, to prove that order exists even in death. And yet, their final demise shows how futile such obsession is. I thought of philosophers who stared too long into the abyss, thinkers who try to chart chaos only to be swallowed by it. This character becomes a tragic echo of that history. Even the smaller roles carry weight. Side characters who appear briefly are given enough detail to feel real, enough humanity to make their loss sting. This is rare in horror, where minor characters are often disposable. Here, even the briefest faces leave an imprint, reminding us that every life, no matter how briefly shown, carries significance. I appreciated this deeply because it aligns with the philosophy at the heart of the story, that inevitability does not discriminate, that every thread is woven into the same fragile fabric. As I reflect on the cast as a whole, I realize they function not just as individuals, but as symbols. Each represents a facet of our own struggle with mortality. The seer represents knowledge. The skeptic represents denial. The obsessive represents control. The reckless represents defiance. The quiet one represents surrender. Together, they are humanity in miniature, a fractured mirror reflecting our many ways of coping with the one truth we cannot outrun. This, I think, is what gives a film its resonance. We do not simply watch strangers die. We watch ourselves in pieces, confronting inevitability. What stays with me most, however, is not their deaths, but their moments of living. The nervous laughter shared after a near miss. The tearful confessions whispered in the dark. The brief tenderness of a hand clasped before doom strikes. These are the moments that matter. They remind us that even in the shadow of inevitability, humanity persists. Fear does not erase love. Despair does not erase connection. Even as the film marches its characters toward tragedy, it grants them small fragments of grace, and those fragments shine. When the final survivors face their last moments, what we see is not merely fear, but a strange kind of acceptance. Their eyes, hollow but calm, reflect the truth that perhaps the only choice we have is how we meet the inevitable. In them, I saw echoes of countless stories across time, heroes who face fate not with victory but with dignity, not with triumph but with humanity intact. The characters of this film, for all their flaws, carry that dignity in the end, and that is why they linger in memory. As I sit here now, thinking back on each of them, I realize that this story is less about their deaths than about their humanity under siege. The deaths are spectacular, yes, but the humanity is what cuts deep. Each character reveals something about us. Our denial, our hope, our obsession, our rebellion, our surrender. They are not strangers on a screen, but fragments of ourselves, woven into a narrative that refuses to let us look away from the truth we fear most. And in that refusal lies the power of their story. Every film carries with it stories that never make it to the screen, fragments of truth and rumor that orbit the finished product like faint satellites. Some are funny, some are eerie, some are almost unbelievable, yet together they weave a parallel narrative that deepens our experience of the film. Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, being a child of horror and fate, carries with it an especially rich set of these strange facts. The oddities, the accidents, the whispered tales from behind the cameras, all of them create a haunting echo that lingers long after credits roll. I find myself drawn to these details because they remind me that cinema is not only what is written in the script, but also what happens around it, what shapes it in hidden ways. The first strange fact that struck me concerns the film's casting. Unlike many horror franchises that rely on newcomers eager for their first big break, this installment chose to blend fresh talent with actors who carry long histories in horror. It was said that some cast members had strange experiences with déjà vu while filming, as though they had walked through these scenes before. One actor allegedly confessed in an interview that shooting the premonition sequence gave them nightmares so vivid they began to question whether they too might be glimpsing their own end. Hearing this, I thought of how art and life sometimes blur, how immersing oneself in a fictional death can stir real anxieties buried deep within us. Then there were production mishaps, the kind that almost seemed too ironic for a film about inevitability. During one major set piece involving collapsing structures, part of the rig actually malfunctioned. No one was harmed, but the incident spooked the crew enough that whispers began circulating about a curse. Some refused to walk under certain lighting rigs afterward, and a few even carried small talismans in their pockets during filming. I found this darkly poetic, that a film about escaping fate would inspire its crew to act as though fate were truly stalking them. It reminded me of old stories about cursed productions like The Exorcist or Poltergeist, where accidents became part of mythology. Perhaps we invent curses because we cannot accept coincidence, or perhaps some stories carry a shadow that refuses to stay on the page. One of the strangest facts lies in the choice of filming locations. Rather than building entirely artificial sets, the filmmakers used abandoned real-world sites, shuttered factories, crumbling highways, even an old amusement park whose rides still creaked in the wind. The choice gave the film a tactile realism, but also stirred unease among the cast. More than one actor claimed to have heard strange noises during night shoots, voices when no one stood, or footsteps echoing in empty corridors. These reports were dismissed officially as tricks of acoustics, but privately, the story spread. I thought of how spaces themselves carry memory, how walls remember the vibrations of the lives once lived within them. To film a story about inevitability in places abandoned by time feels like calling forth those memories, and the result seeps into the film's atmosphere. There were also peculiar rituals on set. It was whispered that one of the assistant directors insisted on beginning each day with a small, private prayer, even though they had never been religious before. Others formed small superstitions, never starting to take on the 13th try, always tapping the doorframe before walking into certain rooms. These details sound small, almost comical. Yet they fascinate me because they reveal how deeply the film's subject matter infiltrated the psychology of those making it. When you spend months surrounded by images of sudden death, perhaps it is inevitable that you begin seeking patterns, charms, and rituals to hold chaos at bay. The script itself carried its own oddities. I learned that multiple endings were written and even filmed, each presenting a slightly different interpretation of fate's design. The final choice, of course, is the one we now know, but somewhere in the vaults lie alternate versions of how the survivors might have met their end. The idea of these ghost endings, unseen possibilities of how inevitability could have unfolded, haunts me. It feels like a mirror of life itself, where countless paths remain unseen, abandoned, yet still hovering in the shadows of what might have been. Another strange fact concerns the Bloodlines theme that gives the film its subtitle. This element was reportedly inspired by real folklore, by old European tales in which families believed certain curses or misfortunes were inherited. The screenwriter is said to have drawn from stories of dynasties plagued by repeated accidents, generations where tragedy seemed to echo. I find it fascinating how ancient myths continue to seep into modern horror, shaping narratives with whispers from the past. It is as though we cannot escape these old fears, only dress them in contemporary clothes. One of the eeriest behind-the-scenes details involves the use of practical effects. While digital technology could have been employed for most of the elaborate death sequences, the filmmakers insisted on staging as much as possible physically. This meant constructing elaborate contraptions that mimicked accidents, machines that spilled objects in chain reactions, rigs that simulated collapsing structures. The crew spoke of the unnerving realism of these setups. One technician reportedly refused to test one of the rigs after claiming it gave them a bad feeling, and indeed, the rig malfunctioned days later during an actual shoot. The irony of building death machines for fiction that nearly cause real harm is almost too sharp to ignore. Even the soundtrack carries peculiar detail. It is said that during early recording sessions, strange feedback sounds kept intruding into the tracks, distortions no one could explain. The engineers eventually resolved the issue, but some swore the sounds resembled whispers, like voices caught between frequencies. I know such stories can easily be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but the idea still unsettles me. Sound, after all, is vibration, and perhaps vibrations carry more than we realize. The cast themselves reported a peculiar bond forming during filming. Horror, especially when built around inevitability, seems to draw people together strangely. One actor mentioned that off-camera, they felt more protective of each other than on any other set they'd worked. Perhaps when you spend your days rehearsing death, you cling more tightly to life in your hours off. There were reports of nightly dinners, impromptu gatherings, even moments where cast members checked on each other's safety outside of work. I find this both heartwarming and haunting. That fiction created bonds precisely because of the shadow it cast. A stranger fact still. Some fans believe that the promotional posters themselves carry hidden patterns, echoes of the deaths in the film encoded within them. Whether this was intentional marketing or the imaginative projection of devoted viewers, I cannot say, but I am fascinated by how audiences, too, seek patterns and inevitability, how we invent designs even when none are proven. It mirrors the very theme of the story itself. Our desperate need to believe there is order, even in chaos. And then there are the personal stories, the rumors whispered by extras and minor crew. One claimed they narrowly avoided a car accident while driving home after a late shoot, an event so eerily similar to the film's narrative that they quit the production. Another swore that during a night shoot, they saw someone standing at the edge of the set, only for security to confirm no one was there. These stories, unverifiable and strange, add to the film's aura. Whether true or not, they cling to it, deepening the sense that Final Destination stories do not stay confined to screens. What strikes me about all these oddities is how they transform a film into something larger than itself. It ceases to be just a horror movie and becomes an event, a myth, a story haunted not only by its script, but by its making. The strangest facts, whether real or embellished, invite us to see the film as porous, as if the boundary between fiction and reality is thinner than we like to believe. And isn't that, in a way, the essence of horror? The intrusion of the unreal into the real, the collapse of the safe distance between screen and self. When I think of all these details together, the malfunctioning rigs, the whispers and soundtracks, the abandoned spaces, the superstitions, the alternate endings, I feel the film is more than narrative. I feel its atmosphere as a cultural object soaked with unease. It makes me reflect on how stories themselves can be haunted, how sometimes the act of telling them seems to summon echoes that cannot be dismissed. And whether or not these strange facts are entirely true almost doesn't matter, because they reveal something truer, that we, as humans, crave mystery, that we look for patterns in shadows, that we cannot resist the lure of a cursed whisper behind the camera. As I sit with these stories now, I find myself smiling and shivering at once. Smiling, because I love how myths grow around films, how they become richer for the whispers attached to them. Shivering, because some part of me wonders if inevitability really does slip through celluloid, if telling stories of death so vividly calls it closer. That unease, I think, is the real gift of these strangest facts. They remind us that cinema is not just escape but encounter, not just fiction, but a brush against truths we cannot name. When I think of what gives a film lasting power, what elevates it beyond spectacle into something that lingers in the mind and spirit, it is always the events themselves and the way they resonate critically. Not just what happens, but what those happenings mean, what they stir in us long after the lights return to the room. Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, is full of moments that, on the surface, are staged accidents and deaths, yet underneath, they are meditations on inevitability, on the fragility of life, and on the way humans respond when confronted with forces too large to master. To speak of its events critically is to step into a hall of mirrors where horror becomes philosophy and every gasp hides a question. The inciting disaster, for instance, is more than a spectacle of destruction. Yes, it is staged with technical brilliance, with an orchestration of collapsing parts that leave the audience breathless. But what struck me most, sitting with it afterward, was its commentary on modern life's fragility. The disaster begins with something small, something so ordinary it might have been overlooked. A misplaced part, a distracted glance, a routine taken for granted. From that minor oversight blooms chaos. And isn't that how life often is? We imagine catastrophe as enormous, overwhelming, born of storms and earthquakes, but in reality, it so often begins with something simple. A loose bolt, a forgotten word, a turn taken a second too late. This scene reminded me of the terrifying truth that our lives hang on the smallest details. Details we cannot possibly control all the time. The critical perspective here is not just awe at cinematic destruction, but reflection on the delicate latticework that holds existence together. The vision itself, given to the central character, is another event loaded with meaning. On the surface, it is a franchise's signature device, the way we as viewers are allowed to see death before it comes. But underneath, it is about knowledge and its burden. To see the future is not liberation, but imprisonment. The character does not gain freedom, but gains weight, the crushing responsibility of knowing and the impossibility of changing enough. I thought of myths where mortals are granted glimpses of fate, only to be destroyed by the knowledge. Cassandra cursed to foresee but never be believed. Oedipus doomed by the very prophecy he sought to avoid. In this event, the film participates in that ancient conversation. What does it mean to know? What is knowledge worth if it cannot save? The vision becomes less a plot device and more a philosophical wound. As the survivors cheat death in the opening disaster and begin to die one by one afterward, the pattern of their deaths becomes another critical layer. Each event is not random but ironically tailored, often involving the very things they trust most. The friend who finds comfort in technology dies because of it. The one who relies on strength is undone by fragility. The one who believes in order is consumed by chaos. It is as though inevitability itself has a cruel sense of humor, mocking the very traits that define them. From a critical perspective, these events expose the futility of human arrogance. We build machine systems and routines to shield ourselves, and yet those very shields can become weapons. The film critiques our illusion of safety, reminding us that no creation is beyond collapse. There is one death in particular, staged halfway through, that I found difficult to watch not because of gore, but because of its sheer irony. A character who has spent much of the film studying patterns, desperate to outwit inevitability, finally believes they have cracked the code. They act with confidence, even joy, as though the weight has lifted. And in that very moment, they are taken in a swift, shocking accident. From a critical lens, this event embodies the tragedy of hubris. Knowledge, or the illusion of it, becomes the trigger for downfall. It echoed for me the stories of Icarus flying too close to the sun, of countless philosophers undone by their own certainty. In this single event, the film critiques our endless desire to control what cannot be controlled, our arrogance in believing we can master the unmasterable. The introduction of the Bloodlines theme is itself a critical event. It shifts the narrative from randomness to inheritance, from accidents of fate to patterns of lineage. This choice carries immense symbolic weight. It suggests that inevitability is not only universal but also intimate, that some families carry curses deeper than others. Critically, it opens conversation about generational trauma, about the patterns that ripple through blood. I thought of real families I've known where alcoholism or violence repeats itself across decades, where children seem fated to repeat the sins of their parents. By linking survival and death to bloodlines, the film invites us to consider how much of our lives are truly our own and how much is shaped before we are even born. This event transforms the film from a mere horror spectacle into a meditation on inheritance and destiny. The escalating paranoia among the survivors is another layer worth analyzing. As deaths mount, suspicion and resentment grow. Arguments erupt, trust fractures, alliances dissolve. From a critical perspective, these events speak to how human communities respond to crisis. Instead of uniting, we often turn inward, suspicious of each other, desperate to assign blame. It reminded me of literature about plagues and disasters, how fear divides as much as it binds. In these arguments, in the shouting matches and tearful accusations, I saw reflected our own societies when crisis strikes. The event is not just about individuals falling apart, but about the fragility of community when pressed by fear. The climax, where the survivors believe they found a loophole and attempt to outmaneuver fate, is the most telling critical moment. On the surface, it is a tense, thrilling sequence, filled with near misses and razor-thin escapes. But beneath the adrenaline lies commentary on human stubbornness. Even when all evidence suggests inevitability cannot be beaten, we try anyway. We build elaborate plans, rituals, sacrifices, strategies, all in a hope of carving out one more day. This event is about resistance itself, about humanity's refusal to go quietly, even when going quietly might be wiser. I thought of medical treatments that extend life by mere months, of wars fought against impossible odds, of personal struggles where hope persists even when logic says surrender. The climax critiques and celebrates this stubbornness at once. It shows its futility, but also its beauty. The final deaths, particularly the twist that survival only reshapes the pattern rather than ends it, are the film's most haunting events. Critically, they reveal the true message: inevitability cannot be outwitted, only delayed. This is not cynicism but realism, a reminder of what we already know but prefer to ignore. Every reprieve in life is temporary. Every breath is borrowed. These events strip away illusion and leave us face to face with the truth we avoid daily. And yet, there is also strange grace in them. The final survivors, hollow-eyed but calm, show that perhaps acceptance is itself a kind of victory. The event is not triumph but recognition, and that recognition resonates far beyond horror. From a critical perspective, the entire film can be seen as a parable about control. The events mock our belief that we can master fate, that we can build walls strong enough, systems complex enough, knowledge vast enough to defeat death. Each sequence, each accident, is a reminder of fragility. Watching it, I thought of the modern world's obsession with safety, with risk management, with endless attempts to predict the unpredictable. The film quietly critiques this obsession by showing us how easily it unravels. It reminds us that the pursuit of control can blind us to the inevitability we should instead accept with humility. There is also an emotional resonance in the way the events unfold. Each death is shocking, yes, but also deeply sad. These are not faceless strangers, but characters we have come to know, however briefly. Their ends are not just losses of life, but losses of potential, of stories cut short. Critically, this raises a question of how we value life itself. Do we value it for its length or for the moments it carries? The film seems to suggest the latter, that what matters is not how long we live, but how deeply we live in the time we are given. Each event becomes a meditation on the brevity of life and the importance of presence. Even the smaller, quieter events carry weight. A near miss, a sudden silence, a character staring too long at a fragile object. These are not filler but threads in the tapestry. They build unease, yes, but they also remind us of how much meaning small things carry. From a critical lens, these moments critique our blindness to the ordinary. We live surrounded by fragility and rarely see it. The film forces us to see, and in seeing, we are unsettled. What I carry with me most after reflecting critically on these events is the sense that the film is less about death than about life. Death is the frame, inevitability the canvas, but what is painted is our struggle to live, to connect, to resist, to accept. Each event, no matter how terrifying, is a commentary on our humanity, on the ways we face what we cannot change. Some resist, some collapse, some surrender, some rage. All are human, all are true. When the credits roll, the events remain with us not as shocks, but as questions. How do we live knowing we will die? How do we face inevitability? With denial, with obsession, with rebellion, with quiet grace. These questions are the true legacy of the film's events, and they transform horror into philosophy, spectacle into meditation. That, for me, is why this story matters, why it lingers, why it deserves not just to be watched, but to be thought about deeply. Every film is two films. The one we see on the screen, polished and complete, and the one that unfolds behind the cameras, raw and unpredictable. The finished work may feel inevitable, but behind the scenes, nothing is inevitable. Only effort, mistakes, improvisations, and small miracles. With Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, the behind-the-scenes journey was almost as fascinating as the film itself. Filled with challenges, unexpected moments, and fun stories that revealed just how much artistry and accident combined to bring horror to life. One of the most striking production choices was the emphasis on practical effects. In an era where studios lean heavily on CGI, the filmmakers decided that inevitability should feel tactile, that the accidents and deaths must carry weight and texture. So, they built elaborate contraptions that mimic chain reactions, each carefully engineered like a deadly Rube Goldberg machine. Watching footage from the set, I marveled at how much effort went into these devices. Hundreds of moving parts, all designed to collapse in sequence. What fascinates me is how fragile the illusions were. A single mistime fall, a single loose wire, could ruin an entire shot. And yet, the crew rehearsed again and again until the timing was perfect. It reminded me of theater, of the precision required in live performance. Except here, instead of applause, the reward was convincing death. There's something ironic about building machines of destruction for the sake of art. Technicians would laugh during breaks about how they had essentially become inventors of accidents. One crew member even joked that if their film careers failed, they could design rides for theme parks or safety drills for emergency services. I find humor like this heartwarming because it shows how people cope with the macabre by transforming it into play. And in a sense, isn't that what horror films are? Our fears transformed into stories we can play with. Filming the opening disaster sequence was reportedly the most challenging part of the entire production. The set involved collapsing structures, explosions, and a highway pileup recreated in terrifying detail. Dozens of stunt performers, precision drivers, and safety officers had to coordinate like dancers in a deadly ballet. One mistake could have caused real injury. In interviews, the stunt coordinator spoke of the adrenaline on set, the sense that everyone was not just working, but holding their breath together. What I find fascinating is how such orchestrated chaos required absolute trust. Each person relied on the others, a reminder that even in creating stories about inevitability, human cooperation is what makes the impossible possible. The locations themselves added a unique flavor. Instead of sterile sound stages, the crew filmed in abandoned factories, desolate highways, and half-forgotten amusement parks. These spaces were chosen for their authenticity, but they carried with them an atmosphere that even the best set designers could not fabricate. Cast members spoke of how eerie it felt to wander through rusted corridors or sit among broken rides between takes. One actor mentioned that they avoided a certain corner of the factory because the shadows seemed too deep, too alive. I love how locations themselves became characters, lending texture not only to the film but to memories of those who made it. There were also lighter moments, fun facts that revealed the humanity of the process. For instance, the director reportedly had a tradition of blasting upbeat pop songs between takes of gruesome scenes to keep morale from sinking into darkness. Imagine, if you will, a room where an actor has just performed a chilling death sequence, only for the crew to burst into laughter as a bubblegum pop track fills the air. That strange contrast, horror melting into humor, is what keeps such productions bearable. It reminded me of how even in our darkest moments in life, people crack jokes, play music, find light. The cast developed close bonds through the intensity of filming. Long hours, heavy subject matter, and dangerous stunts forged a kind of family. They would gather in the evenings, sharing meals and telling stories, often joking about which of them would die next on screen. Some even played pranks, setting up fake accidents on set to spook each other. One prank involved rigging a fake falling light during rehearsal. The scream that followed apparently became legendary. These anecdotes remind me of school days when shared challenges bonded us, when laughter was the antidote to stress. For the cast, humor was survival, a way to distance themselves from the darkness they were depicting. A particularly fun detail is that several of the death sequences were inspired not by grand imagination, but by actual crew mishaps during production. A spilled drink that nearly fried equipment, a loose prop that fell unexpectedly. These accidents were noted, exaggerated, and eventually written into the film. It's delightful to think that the movie's most terrifying moments were born from clumsiness and chance. It reinforces the theme itself, how ordinary mistakes magnified can become catastrophes. The costume department had its own challenges. Because inevitability unfolds quickly, characters needed multiple versions of the same outfit. Clean, dirty, bloodied, torn. Some actors joke that they spent more time in the wardrobe room than on set. The detail that fascinated me was how the designers subtly shifted costumes over time to reflect the characters' unraveling. Colors faded, fabrics frayed, layers stripped away. It was as if their clothing carried the story of their fear. This attention to detail, invisible to many viewers, is what makes films feel alive. Another production insight lies in the way the vision sequences were shot. To differentiate them from reality, the cinematographer used experimental camera rigs, lenses that distorted perspective, and lighting that created an otherworldly shimmer. Watching behind-the-scenes footage, I was struck by how physical the process was. Actors were drenched in strobe lights, cameras swung on unusual angles, and sound engineers layered unsettling frequencies beneath the score. The result was a vision that felt immersive, suffocating, almost tactile. It fascinated me to learn that what we interpret as supernatural on screen is often just clever manipulation of lenses and lights. The crew faced real challenges, too. Weather became an enemy during outdoor shoots, with sudden storms forcing delays. At one point, a set was nearly destroyed by high winds, echoing the accidents depicted in the film. Rather than despair, the crew joked that fate itself was testing them. They rebuilt, rescheduled, and carried on. Stories like this remind me of resilience, of how humans adapt even when the universe seems uncooperative. It also made me reflect on the strange mirroring between art and life, how a film about inevitability was itself haunted by near accidents and unpredictable forces. Sound design was another arena of artistry. The team spent weeks creating layers of noises that hinted at unseen danger. The hum of electricity, the creak of wood, the faint rush of wind. These sounds were recorded in unusual places. Empty tunnels, old warehouses, even forests at night. What fascinates me is that some of these recordings captured accidental noises, like distant voices or animals, which are left in the final mix because they added to the unease. Sound, in this way, became a character of its own, whispering the presence of inevitability long before it appeared. Among the funnier stories from set was a catering incident. During one long night shoot, the food truck broke down, leaving the cast and crew hungry and irritable. To lighten the mood, one of the producers ordered dozens of pizzas, which arrived hours later, but were greeted with cheers like a victory. The moment became so memorable that one actor joked they would forever associate pizza with death scenes. I love these stories because they remind us that behind every polished frame are people simply trying to get through a long workday, laughing and eating to keep spirits alive. The editing process revealed another fascinating detail. Because of the elaborate chain reactions, the editors had to cut sequences with almost surgical precision. A single misplaced cut could break the illusion of inevitability. They worked frame by frame, sometimes over days, to ensure each accident flowed naturally. One editor remarked that it felt like composing music, with rhythms of tension and release. This insight deepened my appreciation of the craft, how invisible hands shape our experience so completely. There were even playful competitions among the crew. Special effects teams competed to design the most convincing minor accidents, while stunt performers dared each other to improvise creative near misses. This sense of play infused the production with energy. It reminded me of how creativity often thrives under challenge, how limits push people to invent new solutions. Even in a film about death, the making of it became a celebration of imagination. What fascinates me most about all these insights is how they reveal the paradox of horror filmmaking, that creating terror requires immense care, planning, and even love. Every scream is choreographed, every accident rehearsed, every drop of blood carefully placed. Behind the chaos lies order. Behind the inevitability lies intention. The fun facts, the jokes, the pranks, the pizza nights reveal that making horror is less about darkness and more about community, about people supporting each other through long nights of fear and fatigue. When I think back on this production, I realized that the real story of Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, is not only about characters fleeing inevitability, but about artists confronting their own. The crew faced storms, malfunctions, exhaustion, and fear, yet they persisted. They built accidents to tell a story of accidents, and in doing so, they created something both terrifying and beautiful. The fun facts, the insights, the laughter and shadows, these are the heartbeat behind the screen. And for me, they matter as much as the film itself, because they remind us that stories are made not by inevitability, but by choice, by effort, by countless small human acts stitched together into something larger than any one of them could achieve alone. Every story needs a stage, and in cinema, the stage is not a flat surface, but a living world. The settings of a film shape how we feel, what we anticipate, and how we interpret the events unfolding before us. In Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, the settings are not merely background for terror, but characters in themselves, each location carrying its own mood, its own weight of inevitability. When I think back on the film, what lingers with me are not only the deaths or the characters, but the spaces in which everything unfolds, the highways, the houses, the abandoned buildings, the everyday environments made sinister by the invisible presence of death. The film's cinematic elements, its lighting, its framing, its use of sound and silence, work hand in hand with these settings to create an atmosphere that is suffocating, unnerving, and strangely poetic. The first setting, of course, is the site of the inciting disaster. A wide-open environment, something seemingly safe, becomes the arena for catastrophe. What fascinates me about this choice is how it transforms a familiar space into a nightmare. The openness gives the illusion of safety, plenty of room to move, to escape. But when fate arrives, that openness becomes a trap. The cinematography emphasizes this irony. Wide shots linger on the environment, allowing us to absorb its details, only for those very details to betray us later. A flicker of movement in the background, a subtle instability in the set design, all hints of the chaos to come. Watching this, I thought of how many times I've stood in ordinary spaces, a shopping mall, a road, a concert hall, never considering how fragile their structures might be. The film forces us to consider that fragility, to see space itself as complicit in our vulnerability. As the story progresses, the settings grow more intimate, almost claustrophobic. Survivors retreat into houses, cafes, small meeting places, only to discover that no space is safe. One of the most unnerving sequences unfolds in a kitchen of all places. A room we associate with warmth and nourishment becomes a chamber of dread. The camera lingers on ordinary objects, a kettle hissing, a knife glinting, water spilling across a counter, and suddenly these objects seem alive with menace. It is a reminder that horror thrives not in the exotic, but in the ordinary. Cinematically, this is accomplished through sharp close-ups, long pauses, and carefully timed cuts that make us hyper-aware of detail. Watching it, I found myself glancing around my own kitchen later that night, seeing danger where I had never seen it before. The abandoned locations chosen for filming, the factories, the amusement park, the derelict buildings, add another layer of unease. These spaces are already haunted by time, already marked by absence. Rust, dust, broken glass, peeling paint. These textures create an atmosphere of decay, as though life itself has fled. In one sequence set in a factory, the camera moves slowly through dark corridors, the faint drip of water echoing. The silence feels heavier than any scream. I could almost feel the damp air on my skin. These settings work because they remind us of mortality not just through plot, but through environment. They show us spaces where life once thrived but has now surrendered to entropy. Lighting plays a crucial role in transforming these settings. Bright, sterile light is used sparingly, often in the moments before catastrophe, creating a false sense of clarity. More often, shadows dominate, with light fractured, diffused, or interrupted. Lamps flicker, neon signs buzz, natural light filters through cracks. The cinematographer uses darkness not as emptiness, but as texture, a presence that feels alive. I was struck by how often a frame seemed concealed as much as it revealed, leaving corners of the screen shrouded in suggestion. It made me lean forward unconsciously, as though I might glimpse something hidden there. That act of leaning, of searching, is itself part of the unease. The film makes us complicit in its dread. Cinematography also manipulates perspective. The vision sequences, for instance, distort space with wide-angle lenses, tilted frames, and unsteady movements. The effect is disorienting, like stepping into a dream where physics bend. In contrast, the aftermath scenes are shot with unnerving stillness, the camera holding on faces or objects long enough for discomfort to grow. This interplay of movement and stillness mirrors the rhythm of inevitability. Sudden chaos followed by heavy silence. Watching these shifts, I was reminded of literature that uses sentence length for effect. Long flowing lines contrasted with sharp fragments. Cinema does the same, not with words but with images. Sound design amplifies the settings. Silence becomes as important as noise. In quiet moments, we hear the hum of electricity, the creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of wind. These details make spaces feel alive, as the environment itself is watching. When sound erupts, shattering glass, screeching metal, rushing water, it feels overwhelming, like a sudden collapse of order. I remember one sequence where silence stretched so long that I held my breath, only for the crash that followed to feel like a physical blow. The manipulation of sound in relation to setting turns ordinary spaces into stages for dread. Color palette is another subtle element that deepened the atmosphere. Early scenes carry warmer tones, sunlight, natural hues, that lull us into ease. As the film progresses, colors desaturate. Grays, muted blues, sickly greens dominate. Even flesh tones seem paler, as though life is draining from the world itself. I noticed how reds, when they appear, burst violently against this muted background, making every drop of blood more striking. The gradual draining of color mirrors the survivor's dwindling hope, a visual metaphor woven into the film's very texture. One of the most fascinating settings is the amusement park, a place designed for joy that becomes twisted into menace. Rusted rides creak, neon lights flicker weakly. Laughter once etched into the air, now replaced by silence. There is something uniquely unsettling about spaces built for happiness that have been abandoned. It is as though joy itself has died, leaving only echoes. The cinematography heightens this by framing wide shot of empty rides, then cutting suddenly to close-ups of dangerous moving parts. The juxtaposition of joy and dread, of innocence and menace, lingers powerfully. Watching it, I thought of how memory clings to places, how an abandoned park is not just empty but haunted by the absence of laughter. Another striking setting is the highway used in one of the later sequences. Highways are symbols of movement, of freedom, of escape. Yet here, the highway becomes a corridor of doom, every vehicle a potential weapon. The way it is filmed, long stretches of concrete, framed by endless sky, creates a sense of exposure. There is nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The vehicles become predators, inevitability manifesting as metal and motion. It reminded me of how everyday spaces can transform in an instant. A road is usually freedom. Here, it is inevitability's playground. Even domestic settings like bedrooms and living rooms carry menace. I recall one scene where a character sits quietly at home, only for a chain of tiny accidents, a candle tipping, a curtain catching, to build toward disaster. The setting is intimate, familiar, yet becomes terrifying. Cinematically, this is achieved through careful pacing, lingering on each object, cutting back and forth to build rhythm, making the audience complicit in anticipating disaster. It critiques our false sense of safety within our homes, reminding us that inevitability does not knock before entering. The settings also serve symbolic purposes. The factory represents decay, the amusement park represents lost joy, the highway represents false freedom, the home represents false safety. Each environment mirrors the themes of inevitability and inheritance. From a critical perspective, these settings are not random but carefully chosen reflections of the human condition. They remind us that no space is immune, that death does not respect boundaries of private or public, joyful or sorrowful, familiar or strange. What makes the cinematic elements so effective is their restraint. The film does not overload us with constant noise or chaos. Instead, it alternates between silence and shock, light and shadow, motion and stillness. This rhythm creates unease not through spectacle alone, but through anticipation. I found myself tensing not only during the disasters, but in the quiet moments before them, when a camera lingered too long on a dripping faucet or a swaying lamp. That anticipation, that dread, is where the film's true power lies. When I reflect on the settings and cinematic elements together, what strikes me most is how they transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. A kitchen, a bedroom, a road. These are places we know intimately, by turning them into arenas of inevitability. The film unsettles us not because the spaces are unfamiliar, but because they are too familiar. It is easy to dismiss fear in a haunted castle or a distant planet. It is harder to dismiss fear when it blooms in your kitchen sink or the road outside your window. That transformation is the genius of this film's use of setting. By the time the final act unfolds, the settings themselves seem to conspire with inevitability. Shadows deepen, sounds sharpen, spaces feel smaller. It is as if the world itself is closing in on the survivors, squeezing them toward their inevitable fate. Watching this, I felt a chill not from the deaths themselves, but from the sense that space and time were complicit, that inevitability had seeped into the environment itself. When the credits rolled, I thought less of the plot and more of the spaces inhabited. I thought of kitchens and highways, amusement parks and factories, and how I would never look at them the same way again. The settings lingered like ghosts, reshaping my perception of the ordinary. That, to me, is the mark of effective cinematic design. It does not simply show us horror. It teaches us to see horror in the world we already know. Behind every film lies another film, unseen but no less real. The long days of shooting, the unpredictable challenges, the friendships forged in exhaustion, the quiet frustrations no one outside the crew ever notices. With Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, that hidden film is particularly fascinating because the very act of creating a story about inevitability meant that the cast and crew were constantly living under its shadow. What ended up on screen was haunting enough, but the stories behind it, the odd coincidences, the bonds that formed, the small disasters that nearly derailed production, are what give this project a second, invisible life. The first thing that struck me while reading accounts from those involved was the atmosphere on set. Horror films always carry a strange duality. The work itself is drenched in fear and death, but the people making are often laughing between takes, cracking jokes to cut through the tension. On this film, that duality was extreme. One moment, an actor would be drenched in fake blood, screaming as though their life had ended. The next, the director would yell cut, and someone would hand them a towel, while another blasted cheerful music from a speaker. That constant shifting between dread and levity created an odd rhythm, one that everyone had to adapt to. I find this fascinating because it mirrors life itself. Even in the darkest times, humor slips in, and even in joyful times, shadows lurk nearby. One behind-the-scenes story that stood out was the infamous stunt malfunction during an early disaster scene. The production had built an elaborate rig to simulate collapsing machinery, and during testing, a crucial piece gave way unexpectedly. No one was injured, but the sight of heavy equipment crashing down left the crew shaken. Some whisper about the irony. A film about accidents nearly causing one in real life. Afterward, safety checks became stricter than ever, and the cast joked nervously about the curse of the franchise. I love this story not because of the danger, but because of how quickly people turn fear into myth, how easily humans assign meaning to coincidence. That act of storytelling, even among the crew, shows how deeply inevitability had sunk into their psyche. Another remarkable aspect was the dedication to practical effects. Many of the elaborate death scenes were not purely digital, but involved real physical contraptions. This required endless rehearsals to make sure every chain reaction landed perfectly. Crew members described these setups like giant puzzles, each piece dependent on the others. One technician admitted that watching it felt like gambling. Would the dominoes fall as planned, or would something stop midway? When the rigs finally worked, the applause on set was genuine, like winning a game. I imagine the relief must have been immense, because when you spend hours setting up a shot only to watch it fail, frustration can grow heavy. Yet they persisted, again and again, until the chaos looked perfect. The cast, too, lived through challenges that tested them physically and emotionally. Horror acting is exhausting, not just because of the stunts, but because of the constant adrenaline required. Screaming, trembling, running, collapsing, these take a toll on the body and the voice. Some actors reportedly lost their voices after repeated takes of screaming, and production had to pause briefly to let them recover. Others carried bruises from stunts gone slightly wrong. What amazed me was how committed they remained, pushing through fatigue because they believed in the story being told. There's something noble in that, the willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of creating something larger than oneself. Of course, not everything was dark. There were countless moments of joy and silliness that made their way into behind-the-scenes memory. One prank became legendary. During a rehearsal for a death scene, a crew member replaced fake blood with harmless bright green slime. When it splattered across the set, everyone erupted in laughter, breaking the tension. These small acts of mischief kept spirits alive. Another recurring joke involved predicting who among the cast would die next on screen, turning grim subject matter into a kind of game. It may sound macabre, but in a way it's beautiful. Proof that laughter can coexist with fear, that humanity persists even in the darkest stories. The production also revealed unexpected personal bonds. Actors who had only just met became inseparable after weeks of working together in such intense circumstances. They shared meals late at night, supported each other through emotional exhaustion, and celebrated small victories together. One cast member described the experience as living through our own final destination, a constant sense of uncertainty and fear, but faced together. These bonds mattered because they softened the edges of the experience. When the work became too heavy, the friendships lifted them back up. Interestingly, several crew members reported uncanny coincidences during filming. One person narrowly avoided a real car accident on the way to set. Another had a close call with falling equipment in their garage at home. None of these incidents were catastrophic, but together they created an uneasy sense that life was imitating art. People whispered that perhaps the franchise carried with it a kind of curse, a shadow that followed anyone who worked on it. Rationally, of course, these were coincidences, but emotionally, they became part of the mythology of the production. I think this says something profound about human psychology. When we immerse ourselves in stories about fate and inevitability, we start seeing them everywhere. There were creative struggles, too. The director reportedly fought hard to preserve the film's darker tone, resisting pressure from executives who wanted more humor or lightness. The crew spoke of long discussions late into the night about how far to push the violence, how to balance spectacle with meaning. These conversations mattered because they show that the film was not simply made, but wrestled into existence, shaped by tension as much as vision. I respect that because art worth making often requires conflict, the friction of competing ideas. One of the most moving behind-the-scenes insights came from the costume and makeup teams. They described the process of gradually breaking down the characters' appearances as the story unfolded. Clothing became more torn, faces paler, eyes darker. It was not just continuity, but storytelling through texture and color. Watching their dedication, I realized that these details, though often unnoticed, carry immense weight. They are what make us believe in the unraveling we see on screen. Behind the glamour of cinema lies this quiet labor, often invisible but essential. The film's editing also carried challenges. The intricate chain reactions meant that every cut had to be precise. Editors spent sleepless nights aligning frames, ensuring that a falling object matched perfectly with the next shot of impact. They spoke of it as building a rhythm, like music. What fascinates me here is how invisible this labor is to viewers. We feel the tension, the inevitability, but rarely think of the hands shaping it in dark rooms with glowing screens. The editors, in their quiet persistence, became unseen architects of dread. Even the sound design carried its own behind-the-scenes magic. Recordings were done in unusual places, empty tunnels, abandoned buildings, forests at night, to capture authentic echoes. Engineers spoke of strange moments when unplanned sounds slipped in, distant voices, animal cries, the creak of structures. Some of these were kept in the final mix, adding layers of unease. It's remarkable how even accidents become part of art, how chance itself collaborates with creation. Fun facts continue to emerge when you look closely. For instance, one of the actors admitted they refused to watch their own death scene during playback, saying it felt too eerie. Another revealed that their scream in one sequence was not acting but genuine, triggered by a prop malfunction that startled them. These little truths make the film feel more alive, because they remind us that what looks like pure fiction is often mixed with fragments of reality. What I carry most from these behind-the-scenes insights is the sense of humanity pulsing beneath the horror. Making a film about death required immense trust, care, and connection. Safety officers worked tirelessly to prevent real accidents. Crew members carried each other through exhaustion. Actors leaned on one another emotionally. What emerges is a paradox. A film about inevitability made possible only by relentless human cooperation. That tension between theme and process fascinates me endlessly. When I step back and think about it all, I realize that behind-the-scenes stories matter because they reveal the hidden truth of art, that what we see as inevitable on screen is anything but inevitable in creation. It takes hundreds of choices, countless acts of labor, and infinite small adjustments to create the illusion of fate. The chaos we witness is built on order, the terror on care, the accidents on intention. Knowing this does not ruin the film's power. It deepens it. It reminds us that horror is not just about death, but about life, about people working together to tell stories that unsettle us because they touch something real. When I think of why certain films linger with me, why they do not dissolve the moment the credits fade, it is rarely because of their surface. The plot may thrill me, the acting may move me, the craft may impress me, but what remains long after is always the themes, the ideas that weave themselves into my own thoughts, the symbolism that reshapes the way I see the world around me. With Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, the themes are heavier than usual, layered like sediment at the bottom of a river. You cannot scoop the story up without pulling those layers with it. They stick to you, demanding you confront them. And as I sat with the film afterward, I found myself meditating on death, inheritance, inevitability, and the fragile beauty of human existence in ways that felt more literary than cinematic. At its heart, the theme that dominates is inevitability. This franchise has always circled around that concept, but this installment presses deeper, pressing so hard it feels suffocating. The deaths are not just random shocks. They are reminders that everything has an order, that life bends toward an end no matter how desperately we resist. What I found haunting is how inevitability in the film is not depicted as malicious or vengeful. It is not a villain in the traditional sense. It is simply there, a law of the universe, like gravity. Watching the characters struggle against it, I was reminded of times in my life when I, too, struggled against forces larger than myself. Illness, loss, time itself. These things are not villains, but they shape us, and resisting them often leaves us exhausted. The film symbolizes inevitability not as punishment, but as nature, and that is why it chills so deeply. Another powerful theme woven into the story is inheritance, hinted at directly in the title. The notion that bloodlines matter, that fate may be carried in our veins, is a terrifying one. It suggests that we are not only victims of chance, but also heirs to curses. From a symbolic perspective, blood becomes more than bodily fluid. It becomes the ink in which destiny is written. Watching this unfold, I thought of how families carry burdens across generations. Addiction, silence, cycles of poverty, even patterns of misfortune. These things feel like inherited inevitabilities. The film turns that metaphor into horror, asking us to consider what invisible threads bind us to the past. In one scene, when a character learns of a past tragedy tied to their lineage, the despair in their eyes spoke volumes. It is one thing to die by chance, another to feel marked by birth. The theme of control also pulses through the story. Every survivor grapples with the question, can I master fate, or am I powerless? Some seek control through knowledge, others through denial, others through rebellion. But again and again, the film shows how fragile control is. A single accident undermines the most careful plan. Symbolically, this speaks to our everyday illusions. We plan our careers, our families, our futures, convinced we are steering the ship. Yet how easily one diagnosis, one accident, one random encounter changes everything. Watching the characters chase control, only to lose it, felt like watching myself reflected back in all the times I believed my life was firmly in my hands. The film critiques this illusion, but also sympathizes with it. Because what else can we do but try? Irony is another theme embedded in the symbolism of the deaths. Each demise seems tailored, mocking the traits or habits of the victim. The strong are undone by fragility. the cautious by chance, the skeptical by proof. This ironic pattern is symbolic of life's cruel humor. How often do we see people fall victim to the very thing they thought they mastered? The financial expert bankrupted, the careful driver caught in a freak accident, the healthy eater undone by genetics. The film exaggerates this irony for horror, but beneath it lies the painful truth. We are not as secure as we believe. Symbolism saturates the settings. Kitchens, highways, amusement parks, ordinary spaces become symbols of fragility. A kitchen, usually a symbol of warmth, becomes a place of fire and knives. A highway, symbol of freedom, becomes a corridor of doom. An amusement park, symbol of joy, becomes a graveyard of abandoned laughter. These transformations symbolize how inevitability corrupts even the safest of spaces, reminding us that safety is always conditional. I felt unsettled afterward, looking at my own familiar spaces differently, realizing how thin the line between comfort and catastrophe truly is. The vision itself is symbolic of knowledge's burden. To see the future is not freedom but a curse, echoing myths of prophecy. It symbolizes the paradox of wisdom. To know too much is to suffer. The character who sees a disaster is not empowered but shackled by it. I thought of times when I, too, knew something unpleasant was coming, be it a breakup, a loss, a failure, and how knowing did not lessen the pain but deepened it. The film transforms it feeling into a literal vision, forcing us to confront the double edge of foresight. One subtle theme I noticed was community versus isolation. At first, the survivors are bound together, sharing fear, clinging to each other. But as deaths mount, suspicion and anger erode those bonds. They isolate, they accuse, they fracture. Symbolically, this speaks to how trauma impacts human connection. Some tragedies bind families and communities together. Others rip them apart. The film suggests that inevitability, in the end, isolates us. Each death is faced alone. Each character, no matter how connected they were, meets their end in solitude. This loneliness is as terrifying as the deaths themselves, a reminder that mortality is something we cannot share. Another symbolic thread lies in objects. Everyday items, cups, wires, fans, windows, become harbingers of death. Symbolically, this suggests that inevitability does not come from grand monsters, but from the fabric of ordinary life. It critiques our blindness to fragility, showing us that what we trust most can betray us. I found myself staring at ordinary objects differently after the film, imagining them as potential instruments of fate. That symbolic shift lingers, reshaping perception long after viewing. Hope and despair also form a thematic pair. Characters grasp at hope, at loopholes, at rituals, even when despair is more rational. This tension symbolizes the human spirit itself. We are creatures of hope, clinging to it even in poisoned soil. The film critiques hope as delusion, but also honors it as resilience. When characters fight to survive despite knowing survival is impossible, I saw not foolishness but humanity. Hope, even when futile, gives dignity to existence. The climax carries the heaviest symbolism, when the survivors attempt to cheat inevitability with a plan, only to discover that survival reshapes rather than ends a pattern. The symbolism is clear. Life itself is only borrowed time. Every escape is temporary, every reprieve conditional. Symbolically, this ending confronts us with mortality, not as punishment but as truth. I felt hollow watching it, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed what I already knew and preferred to forget. The symbolism forces us to face mortality without disguise. Blood itself becomes a recurring symbol. Beyond inheritance, it represents both life and death, connection and curse. The sight of blood in the film is not only gore but metaphor, reminding us that we are fragile, that within us flows both vitality and vulnerability. In literature, blood often symbolizes lineage, sacrifice, or guilt. Here, it embodies all three. Watching it, I thought my own veins, the pulse beneath my skin, and how fragile it is. Silence is symbolic, too. The long pauses before accidents symbolize the thin stillness before catastrophe in real life. How often do we move through quiet moments, unaware of how close we are to disaster? The film's use of silence embodies that fragility, making stillness itself terrifying. What I admire most about the film's themes and symbolism is how they elevate horror into philosophy. Death is not a monster here, but a mirror reflecting our denial, our arrogance, our hope, our inheritance. The symbolism is relentless, reminding us that inevitability lives not outside us, but within us, in our blood, in our families, in our homes, in our illusions of safety. When the credits finally rolled, I felt heavy, not from fear, but from thought. The themes lingered like a quiet echo, reminding me that stories like this are not about gore, but about truth. The symbolism reshaped my gaze. Kitchens as fragile, highways as dangerous, blood as inheritance, silence as omen. That is a true horror, not what we see on screen, but what we carry with us afterward. Every film is an illusion made possible by technique. We often forget this when we're swept away by the story, when we gasp or flinch or lean forward in our seats. But behind every gasp lies a decision. The angle of the camera, the choice of sound, the rhythm of an edit. In Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, the techniques themselves are as fascinating as the story, because they're designed not only to entertain but to unsettle, to make us distrust even the safest moments. The craft is invisible in the moment but unmistakable in reflection, and when I think of how the film achieved its atmosphere, I am struck again and again by how deliberate every choice was. Camera work is the spine of the film's unease. Wide shots establish spaces that feel familiar and ordinary. Then the lens shifts suddenly to unnerving close-ups, a dripping faucet, a loose nail, the tremor of glass. The tension comes not from what we see, but from what we are made to suspect. Cinematographers know this, and here they wield it like poetry. One scene lingers on a ceiling fan spinning lazily, cutting back to it again and again until we can't help but expect it to fall. It becomes unbearable, and when the accident finally comes, it feels not like surprise, but like confirmation of a dread already planted. I thought about how life itself often feels like this, the slow buildup of tension before something small but devastating tips over into catastrophe. Angles matter deeply too. Low angles make ordinary objects loom. High angles make characters feel diminished, as though inevitability itself is towering over them. Tilted frames, where the camera is slightly off balance, symbolize the instability of a world. Watching, I realized how much my body reacted to these shifts. My posture would tighten, my eyes narrow, as if the screen itself were unsettled. That physical reaction is a success of technique. Not just telling us something is wrong, but making us feel it without a word spoken. Lighting carries its own language. Early scenes glow in natural light, warm and safe, but as the story unfolds, shadows dominate. Lamps flicker, neon buzzes, firelight glows briefly before extinguishing. Light is never stable here. It quivers like the characters themselves. The symbolism is obvious but effective. Life itself flickers. One moment shines, the next darkens. And when darkness wins, it is total, swallowing the screen. I remember one sequence where a character stood half in shadow, half in light, the cinematography whispering what the script did not, that they were already half claimed by inevitability. Sound, though, is perhaps the most unsettling tool. Silence stretches until it feels like pressure in the ears. Tiny noises are amplified. The creak of wood, the hiss of gas, the ticking of a clock. Then, when catastrophe strikes, the sound explodes, overwhelming us. This rhythm, silence, 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 eruption, becomes its own form of inevitability. Our bodies tense before the sound even comes, as though we are wired to anticipate disaster. What struck me most was how the sound design extended even into scenes without death. Ordinary dialogue carried faint hums in the background, noises that made spaces feel alive and hostile. It reminded me that in horror, sound is not accessory but architecture, the walls on which the house of fear is built. Editing ties it all together. The film's rhythm is deliberate. Long, lingering shots cut suddenly into bursts of rapid cuts during accidents. Time itself feels manipulated. In visions, the editing is disorienting. Flashes of images overlapping, leaving us as breathless as the character experiencing them. In deaths, the pace accelerates, building to chaos before snapping into silence. The precision required for this rhythm is astonishing. Editors spoke of spending days on a few minutes, crafting the exact flow of tension. Watching it, I could feel their work not as thought but as sensation, the racing heart, the held breath, the sudden release. Editing is invisible in success, but here it was palpable. Special effects deserve their own reflection. What makes this installment stand out is a reliance on practical rigs, with CGI used only to enhance rather than replace. That choice grounds the accidents in tactile realism. When glass shatters, it truly shatters. When fire flares, it truly burns. The digital polish smooths edges but never dominates. I find this approach refreshing because horror loses its bite when it feels artificial. The authenticity here makes the symbolism sharper. Death feels not like spectacle but like possibility. The vision sequences were particularly inventive. To differentiate them from reality, the filmmakers used distorted lenses, shaking rigs, and strange color grading that gave images an otherworldly shimmer. Watching these, I felt as though the world itself had tilted. The techniques mimic dreams, where ordinary logic dissolves. Yet the symbolism deepens. Visions are dreams we cannot escape, nightmares that become reality. By bending technique, the filmmakers bend perception itself. Performance technique cannot be ignored either. Actors did not simply scream and die. They embodied the exhaustion, paranoia, and fragile hope that defined their characters. Directors encouraged them to improvise in moments of fear, leading to scenes that felt raw, unscripted. One actor admitted that their most convincing scream came not from acting, but from genuine shock when a rig malfunctioned unexpectedly. This blending of planned and accidental creative performances that feel unervingly real. I admire this because it shows how technique is not just mechanical but emotional, a collaboration between human vulnerability and artistic craft. Symbolism emerges even in costume design. Outfits begin bright and intact, but as the story unfolds, colors fade, fabrics tear, and characters look increasingly drained. Subtle details, a stain here, a fray there, mirror the unraveling of hope. Costume becomes narrative without words, another layer of technique shaping our subconscious experience. Box office production tells its own story, one less artistic, but equally revealing. When the film was released, expectations were cautious. Horror franchises carry both loyalty and fatigue, and studios wonder if audiences still hunger for inevitability after so many installments. Yet opening weekend numbers stunned even skeptics. Packed theaters, audiences gasping and whispering, critics noting how the film revived old fears with new resonance. It all combined into success. The film exceeded projections, marking one of the strongest horror openings of the year. I find this telling because it proves that themes of inevitability still resonate deeply in our time. Perhaps, in an age of uncertainty, we are drawn to stories that force us to confront uncertainty head-on. International box office performance revealed even more. Different cultures responded uniquely, some seeing the Bloodline theme as echoing their own ancestral myths, others drawn to the universal fear of accidents. I love how cinema, though made in one place, becomes a mirror for many. It reminded me of literature traveling across languages, carrying its symbolism but absorbing new interpretations wherever it goes. Critics often discuss box office numbers coldly, as figures and charts. But behind every number lies a human response. Tickets bought, hearts raced, discussion sparked. The box office is not just revenue but evidence of impact. This film's success shows how craft and theme, when combined, still draws to theaters despite the lure of streaming. People wanted to feel inevitability together. In a dark room with strangers, their gasps blending into a shared echo. That communal experience is priceless, and the numbers only hint at its depth. When I step back and consider both the techniques and the box office, I see a paradox. On one hand, the film is built with surgical precision, every frame and sound engineered. On the other, its success was unpredictable, shaped by audience hunger and cultural resonance. That tension between craft and chance mirrors the very themes of the story. Just as characters cannot control fate, filmmakers cannot control reception. They can only prepare, sculpt, labor, and then release their creation into a world where it may flourish or fail. That unpredictability is its own inevitability. I think of the editors laboring over a single cut, the sound engineers recording whispers in tunnels, the actors bruising their voices with screams, the box office analysts counting tickets, and I realize they are all part of the same dance. Humans trying to impose order on chaos. The techniques create the illusion of inevitability. The box office measures its echo, and together they reveal the strange power of cinema. It unsettles us, entertains us, frightens us, and then reflects our own fragility back to us. When I left the theater and later reflected on the film's success, I realized that what I carried most was not the spectacle of death, but the spectacle of craft. The tilted cameras, the flickering lights, the suffocating silences, the roar of box office numbers, all of it became part of the same story. A story not only about characters on screen, but about the artists behind it, about the audiences drawn to it, about the invisible techniques that shape our emotions. That is the true achievement of this film, not just its narrative inevitability, but its technical inevitability. The way it uses every tool of cinema to pull us, unresisting, toward fear and thought alike. What gives a film its pulse is never only the script or the technique, but the people who embody it. Actors breathe life into words, and in doing so, they give us something to care about before inevitability tears it away. In Final Destination, Bloodlines 2025, the cast approached this with a kind of seriousness that elevated what could have been disposable horror into something human. And when I think of this film now, I do not only see its accidents and visions. I see the faces of the cast, frightened, defiant, exhausted, tender, and I hear the voices of both creators and audiences reflecting on what it meant to them. The lead actor, the one who bore the burden of the vision, spoke in interviews about the difficulty of carrying fear every day on set. They describe how exhausting it was to live in the skin of someone who constantly sees death coming, how at night they would dream of accidents, waking in sweats that felt too real. Yet they also spoke of gratitude, of how rare it is to play a character so layered in horror, philosophy, and vulnerability. What touched me most was when they admitted that the role forced them to confront their own mortality in ways they had avoided. "I used to never think about death," they said softly in one interview. "Now I think about it every day, not with dread, but with awareness." That struck me deeply, because it reminded me that art does not only change audiences, it changes those who make it. Supporting cast members carried their own weight. The skeptic, the one who denied the vision until it became undeniable, said they based their performance on someone they knew personally, a friend who refused to accept warning signs until it was too late. Their laughter during interviews carried a bittersweet edge, as if they were still haunted by how close fiction had come to truth. Another cast member, who played the obsessive survivor, revealed that they journaled extensively in character, filling notebooks with patterns and diagrams as though they themselves were trying to outwit fate. These journals were never seen on screen, but the practice gave depth to their performance. I find details like this fascinating. The hidden labor actors pour into roles that audiences never know about, invisible work that nonetheless breathes life into the final product. The reckless character, the one who dared fate with bravado, admitted that much of their energy came from personal experience. They had once lived recklessly, they confessed, driving too fast, chasing thrills, laughing too loudly at danger. Playing this role, they said, was like staring at an old version of myself and burying him. That admission stayed with me. It made me realize how much of ourselves we see in the roles we play, how acting is not just pretense but confrontation. Even smaller cast members left impressions in interviews. One actress spoke of her death scene with surprising tenderness. She said the hardest part was not pretending to die, but thinking of leaving people behind. How the character's final glance was meant as a farewell to a life unfinished. She admitted she cried after filming, not from fear but from sorrow. And in her words, "I heard something true, that the real horror is not in the manner of death but in the interruption of life." The director's interviews added another layer. They described the challenge of balancing spectacle with meaning, of wanting each death not to be mere shock, but metaphor. Every accident had to say something, they explained, not just about death, but about how we live. That artistic ambition impressed me, because it showed that even in a franchise built on elaborate demises, there was room for philosophy. The director admitted to studying literature and philosophy before entering film, and perhaps that is why this installment feels heavier, more meditative. They carried those ideas into every frame. Crew interviews revealed humor behind the fear. Stunt coordinators joked about designing death machines that required more rehearsal than ballet. Makeup artists laughed about gallons of fake blood staining their hands for days. Editors described how they lost count of how many hours they spent replaying the same accidents